Hello.
Hello. Good evening and a very warm Franciscan welcome to all of you to our final webinar in the series on Fratelli Tutti, finding sisterhood and brotherhood to overcome what divides us. Peace and all good. My name is Nora Pfeiffer, Director of the Franciscan Solidarity Tables here at Franciscan Action Network. We at FAN are so grateful that you are here with us today, and we welcome each of you. Even though we are all coming together tonight on this lovely summer evening from hundreds of places geographically throughout the country and perhaps even across our borders, we are connecting on native lands. Living here in Central Virginia, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land I get to call home, the Powhatan and Yidanan nations, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Tonight, we are hosting the final discussion on Fratelli Tutti, which will center on governance and politics. Now, just a couple housekeeping items before we begin. A few notes to keep in mind. We are expecting a large crowd, so we ask that everyone please remain muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions that come to mind that you'd like to include in the Q&A at the end, please do put those in the chat function. We also ask that you use the chat sparingly to minimize distraction, but please do use it to include the questions that makes our conversation much richer. And we will be recording the presentation and we'll send it out afterwards. We wouldn't be able to be here tonight or have this wonderful series on Fratelli Tutti if we couldn't have the joy of welcoming and acknowledging our incredible sponsors whose generosity has enabled events like this to happen. Thank you all so much for your support and collaboration. To begin our time together in prayer, we welcome one of our interns here at Franciscan Action Network, Fernando Cordova.
Thank you, Nora. And I invite all of you to join me in a posture of prayer in however you feel comfortable. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. God our Father, you guide everything in wisdom and love. Accept the prayers we offer for our nation. God of power and might, wisdom and justice, through your authority is rightly administered, laws are enacted, and judgment is decreed. May our leaders always seek the ways of righteousness, justice, and mercy. Grant that they may be enabled to lead our country with honesty and integrity. In your goodness, watch over them so that people everywhere can enjoy freedom, security, and peace. As Pope Francis says in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, recognizing that all people are brothers and sisters, and seeking forms of social friendship that include everyone is not merely utopian. It demands a decisive commitment to devising effective means to this end. Any effort along these lines becomes a noble exercise of charity. We ask this through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Fernando. My name is Steve Schneck. I'm the Executive Director of Franciscan Action Network, and I'm pleased to welcome you all this evening. One of the things that I've just been informed about is that for whatever reason, our audience tonight is limited to 100 people. I have asked our technical people to look into that and see if that could be fixed in short order. But if not, I want to assure everyone, and please pass this along, that a recording will be made available to everyone on Franciscan Action Network's YouTube channel, probably within the day or so. And if you are registered for this event, you will automatically receive a link to that recording. And I apologize for the technical glitch. That said, let me proceed though with our program. It's really a great honor to welcome two extraordinary scholars this evening to talk with us about Fratelli Tutti as it relates to governance and politics. We first introduce Amy Uelmen, who is a lecturer in religion and professional life and special advisor to the Dean of Georgetown Law School, and a senior research fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Amy has authored numerous law review articles, as well as 2 books about political dialogue, how appropriate, both with New City Press. The first entitled 5 Steps to a Positive Vision of Politics, and the second, 5 Steps to Healing Polarization in the Classroom, that second with Michael Kessler as co-author. Amy holds a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Juris Doctor degree, as well as a doctorate in juridical science from Georgetown University. And in addition, she has a master's degree in theology from Fordham University. Amy is a longtime member of the Focolare movement. And let me add, as I mentioned in discussion in the green room behind the curtain just a few minutes ago, Amy is also the wonderful convener of what I think is Washington, D.C.'s most interesting reading group on Catholic social teachings, which includes a number of Catholic intellectuals in the D.C. area. So welcome, Amy. Our second guest this evening is David Cloutier, Associate Professor of Moral Theology at the Catholic University of America. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Carleton, and his PhD degree is from Duke. David teaches primarily Catholic social ethics. He's the author of numerous books, including The Vice of Luxury, Economic Excess in the Consumer Age from Georgetown University Press, Walking God's Earth, The Environment and Catholic Theology, and Reading, Praying, Living, Pope Francis Laudato Si from Liturgical Press. David's writing has appeared in Commonweal in America and in U.S. Catholic, among others. He's currently working on, well, what he calls work in Catholic social thought and the broader topic of how our social structures affect individual moral agency. So welcome, David. And with that, let me just dive right into the first question that I'd like to pose to our experts this evening. And that question is, it's the same question that I have used in all 3 of the previous of our series on Fratelli Tutti. I'd like you to think about and reflect on the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think we all know this story. There's a sojourner who's set upon by robbers and beaten and essentially left to die. And a priest goes by and does nothing. A Levite goes by and does nothing. And finally, the Samaritan, the untouchable, the outcast, really, comes by. And it's the Samaritan, of course, that stops, that tends and ministers to the wounded sojourner, that pays money so that the sojourner can be taken care of in an inn or someplace like that. And not only that, comes back at the end. The question that I'm going to pose to both of you is, what are we to think, given the gloss that Pope Francis has on this parable? What are we to think as a message from this parable to enlighten our considerations of politics and governance? Maybe David, you could go first.
Sure, thanks, Steve. It's great to be with both you and Amy to talk about such a great document. And it's clear that the treatment of the Good Samaritan is really the center of this document. In a way, it could be seen as the first chapter, just as John Paul started many of his encyclicals with a particular biblical story. So Francis is using the Good Samaritan here. Francis, though, he's not a professor like the previous popes, right? We got to remind ourselves of that all the time. And his gift, it has to do with these kinds of profound literary images and contrasts. And it seems to me that using the Good Samaritan is meant to ask us in a very direct, personal way, are we the carer or are we the passerby? Do we look and see the suffering in our world, and are we moved with compassion to stop what we're doing and engage and address it? Or are we the people who have better things to do, essentially, and pass by the side of the road? So I think that the personal choice, or the personal, he calls it the basic decision in one paragraph, that we have to make is whether we're that person or this person. And I think that's the first thing that Francis wants to communicate to us.
Don't forget the robbers too. I think we should wonder whether we're a robber as well.
Yes, well, Francis also does the typical Ignatian composition of place. He asks us to put ourselves in the person of each character, right?
Yeah. What do you think, Amy?
So I'll build on that. I have long been obsessed with this story, and what struck me when I read Fratelli Tutti is also so not only to think, who am I in the story, but how am I moved? And so the translation in English is really unfortunate, right? It's moved with pity, and that's what appears in the English translation of Fratelli Tutti. But the Greek is actually much richer. And I'm in a massacre, so David can help me because he's got a better background in the languages. But I think the word is splagmitomai, which is really kind of moved from the gut. And it gives this just very deep, or moved from the womb, right? So this very deep kind of visceral response. And I think that makes a huge difference also for our discussions about politics. It's like, am I standing back and like organizing what needs to be done from a kind of cold calculus? Or in some ways, do I have like almost no other choice because I'm so viscerally moved based on my human connection to the person that I see? And I think that's a fabulous key for the whole encyclical. And we can talk a little bit later about kind of a politics of tenderness and the ways in which this visceral connection to other human beings makes all the difference in the world in terms of Pope Francis's vision of politics and what we should actually be doing in response to suffering. But it's a great key.
I think that's a marvelous insight, Andy. It reveals. I mean, it reveals, I think, quite a bit about the way that Pope Francis is thinking about these things. So it can't be this sort of, cerebral humanitarianism that sort of loves everybody from afar. I mean, that's not the kind of engagement that he's hoping for in political life. But he really does mean this sort of heart and soul. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Greek word. We'll leave that to David. But that from the gut kind of engagement with a real person, not with numbers, on some sort of spreadsheet, but with real people. I find that really, really interesting. Well, let me pick this up a little bit with another question. And the second question that I want to pose is from chapter 5. The encyclical that chapter 5 is entitled A Better Kind of Politics. And it begins with a criticism of populism. While, and I think we're all familiar with the forms that populism has taken in the last 5 or 6 years, for example. A criticism of that, and while at the same time, His Holiness endorses what he calls popular governance. So I'm curious what's wrong with populism, and I'm curious what's different about popular governance as opposed to populism. And maybe, Amy, you could start with that one.
I was just going to say, this is really David's expertise.
We could ask David to go first.
Yeah, I'm going to kick it over to David, and then he can kick me under the table later.
I am not going to do anything like that. Her Greek was fantastic, and I have no objection. So Francis really thinks that there is a kind of love of the people, your tribe, your homeland. These are words that have certain kinds of connotations for us that are polarizing. But Francis believes that they're good. I mean, I was thinking that moved from the gut reaction is the same word, I believe, that is used in the prodigal son for what the father feels when he sees the son returning, right? And I add that to this particular question, Steve, because I think Francis assumes that we have to have a kind of gut feeling love for our people too, right? So there's a kind of good love of one's people, or love of one's land. And the words that we have for that, like homeland or patriotism or nationalism, they all feel bad now, right?
Right.
But what Francis wants to say is that they're inherently good, that if we're really going to practice social love, we're really going to have this gut feeling where we're moved by other people's suffering, we want to go help them, we have to feel that connection to them. We have to feel that connection to them, but we have to feel it in a way that is open to the stranger, that is open to others. The way he criticizes the populism in today's world is that it's a closed populism. It's a populism that uses that love of your fellow countrymen or countrywoman in order to demonize other people. And ultimately, he says, gain power for the person who's doing the demonizing, right? So the bad kind of populism doesn't actually love people. It just uses the trope of the people in order to gain power for itself.
Interesting. Well, Amy, what do you think? I mean, David kicked this off. He didn't kick you under the table, after all. It seems to me there are several interesting openings there for you to explore.
Yeah, I think the big challenge is the way in which values and inclinations and hopes that could be deeply healthy and deeply human end up getting manipulated. And so I think just a tremendous theme that runs through the whole reflection, and that, I mean, runs through his whole pontificate, is this concern about the way in which greed and power end up as manipulative forces that distort what's actually good. But I find one of the most refreshing dimensions of Pope Francis's papacy and his reflection is also this appreciation of popular piety. And I think that this sense of like the connection to kind of how grassroots people experience their faith, the love for Mary, the way in which spirituality is deeply grounded in so many practices that sustain us also viscerally, right? And so I think he's trying to kind of hold together one of the other themes that to reflect on his kind of intellectual life is the unity of opposites. And so he's trying to kind of hold together some of these tensions, and the appreciation for how little people see and experience the world, I think, is really, really an important key for understanding all of his magisterium generally.
You know, if I could sort of paraphrase, at least sounding to me what you're both saying, is that populism is closed and exclusive, whereas this popular it's still local, but it's open and inclusive, inclusive of the other, inclusive of. I mean, it's really kind of interesting. It's as if His Holiness is suggesting we somehow burrow down in the authenticity of our local experience, but in so doing, we actually find a way to open up ourselves up, to the rest of the world. I actually find that a fascinating way of thinking about it. Let me ask a kind of a practical question. So he's talking about the popular here. Is this an endorsement of democracy, do you suppose?
We're both pausing, right?
I know, but I'm curious. I mean, obviously, this is a classic question in Catholic social teachings. I mean, is democracy somehow to be preferred?
Well, I guess I would take it, and maybe then again kick it over to David, but think about that in light of also his reflections on synodality. And so I think the limits of majoritarian politics in terms of what it can actually do to make sure that the least politically powerful are also cared for in their deep dignity. He says that over and over again. But at the same time, the value of participating in a political structure and political decision making is of course to be deeply affirmed. And so, I mean, as you both might know better than I, its democracy is terrible except for all of the other alternatives, right? And so the sense of, okay, what are the limits? And what I find so interesting about this encyclical is that he holds together also what are the critical resources that we need to keep eyes wide open in light of the distortions of social media, in light of the distortions of the communications machines, in light of the distortions of money and power. And so with all of that said, I think there's a deep appreciation for what democracy can do for deeper participation and responsibility in the world. But it's like the kind of classic yes, but. So not only both and, but yes, but of Catholic social teaching is kind of written all over, I think, this analysis as well.
I want to come back to that participation notion, but let me see if David wants to respond.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, in a way, the central question of the document is almost prior to the question of the system of nation-state government. That there's a set of prior considerations of social love, right? That have to be in place, and the best systems won't replace that. The best systems don't somehow replace that, and arguably, maybe even under bad systems, bad nation-state systems, you still need to practice this kind of the social love. But broadly speaking, it does seem that the document assumes that participatory government is preferable, is what this will look like. Though he cautions, as other popes have, that democracy without values, without commitments to principle, becomes this relativism that I know we're going to talk about later in the program.
Right. This whole notion of participation is fascinating to me, especially because it seems to me, levels of participation or who gets to participate in democracy is such a question right now. It strikes me that for Pope Francis, participation it's not just a process for politics, but it's also a process of formation. We're in a sense formed by participating in our encounter with the other, and politics is just one of the ways in which this participation takes place.
And I think we need to connect this also with the reflections, the current reflections on synodality. And so looking at kind of what is it that we can learn in the church's own reflection and decision-making process, but also how difficult that is, and how much work and how much formation actually we need in order to be thoughtful participants in that decision-making process, and for the difficulties in the Synod on the Amazon, and the Synod on the Amazon as well. So I think we're really at this stage where we need this much deeper maturity in what it means to participate, and struggling as we find ourselves coming up short in that process.
Well, let me turn to one of the most interesting and challenging words in Catholic social thought, and that's the idea of the common good. It's mentioned at least 36 times in Fratelli Tutti. Is there, I mean, given the way that Pope Francis talks about it in this encyclical, in concrete terms, what does he mean by the common good? And is there a measure for the common good here? Amy?
I'm going to kick it over to David. He just he had unmiked before me.
So I mean, the measure is a kind of opposite. It's kind of an oppositional measure. I mean, ultimately, what he contrasts it with is leadership or nationhood that's closed in on itself, that's focused on itself, power, amassing money for itself, amassing prestige, right? And this goes right back to the classic definition of the common good in Aristotle, which contrasts leaders that are focused on the good of the whole state, as opposed to leaders who use the state for their own personal fame and glory and enrichment, right? So I think Francis assumes that what you need high-minded leaders who are really interested in the good of the polity and not just their own good.
Let me just push you on that though a tad, because I always like to smuggle in the idea of the preferential option for the poor here. And so, so the good of the polity, how that it's just kind of pushing the idea of the common good back a little bit further. But would you be willing to say, and I think actually this fits with Pope Francis, but I could be wrong, you guys are the experts. Would you be willing to say that the measure of the common good is the quality of life of the most vulnerable, most marginalized?
Sure. Well, the classic Vatican II definition of the common good is the shared conditions that allow all individuals and groups in the society to attain their own flourishing. The government can't make people flourish, but it can create conditions where every group in the society, every aspect of the society, different enterprises, different racial and ethnic groups, single and married people, elderly people, children, all of these groups can more easily achieve their own flourishing. So certainly the groups that are the most vulnerable are the ones that need the most help in creating those shared conditions.
Right. And so, for example, I would look at the criticism of trickle-down economics, which is mentioned several times in this particular encyclical, as an illustration that you can't just focus on one portion of society. In fact, if you're going to focus on any portion of society, then the preference should be for those on the bottom, the marginalized. So I don't want to push you on this. I think it's kind of stretching beyond the limits of the encyclical itself. So let me just go on to the next question that I'd like to raise. So, and this is something that both of you mentioned to me ahead of our discussion this evening. Both of you raised the topic of illusions of communication. And this is, of course, about media. This is, of course, about the nature of political communication in public life in a variety of ways. But the charge, Pope Francis it essentially indicts what he calls this illusion of communication in chapter 1. And I think what he's doing here, in part, it's parallel to his criticism of relativism, which the Pope blasts in section 206. Relativism in the political sense is seeing everything through the lens of ideology, such that truth disappears in partisanship. I think that's kind of what he's getting at with this idea of illusions of communication, because there is no truth in these illusions. It's just blather and brainwashing and efforts at persuasion. And here I want to come to something that you raised in our private conversation, David, that I think is really interesting. You argued that these illusions of communication are a kind of structural sin, in the same way that flawed economic systems with their flawed conception of the human person also are forms of structural sin. And I just wonder, it's such a fascinating idea. Could you explain that? How is it structural? How is, what we're seeing as quote unquote media, political conversations in American life today, where's the structural sin here?
Yeah, so technology is not neutral. Francis actually says that in Laudato Si. And so I think it's time that we just admitted that social media is a structure of sin, which doesn't mean we need to throw it away any more than we throw away the capitalist system, right? But it means that the structure that is set up inclines or bends us in certain directions as opposed to other kinds of directions. And so, for example, Steve, you brought up the issue of relativism. Francis calls it information without wisdom, right? More information than ever, but less wisdom than ever. And part of this is because the internet makes it so easy for narrative to trump truth. Sorry, I didn't mean to say Trump there. I just said it by accident. But it is so easy in the internet space to just kind of pile on and pile up the narration and not be able to check the facts because the information is overwhelming, right? It's like a fire hose. As opposed to a trickle. There aren't enough moderators. There aren't enough people performing the old functions that newspaper editors performed or other professionals. So I think we need to recognize that this is a major reason why we are unable to practice social love, because so many of our social interactions are mediated by these stories. And ultimately, as you point out, unable to even share facts, unable to even agree on truths that we could then debate rationally about what to do about those truths.
I would say it's as if truth no longer really matters. It's mere persuasion. But let me turn to Amy on that, because she too found this particular, asked me to raise this particular topic. Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of, so what do we do once we recognize, as David says, once we recognize that we're enmeshed in these patterns and that they're very powerful and very addictive. And so I think it would be interesting to do a little bit of a study of pace in the encyclical. And the number, the images, the ways in which Pope Francis suggests that we slow down, that we sit down, that we find kind of these spaces of physical proximity with our dialogue partners, and that necessarily also means slowing down. And so I think the challenge of how do we create spaces of physical presence? What does that mean now in the wake of the pandemic? I mean, I think like any of these commitments, just to ask ourselves, okay, well, how does this commitment show up in my calendar? How does it show up in my budget? Right. And so the way to take these very, high altitude ideas and make them concrete, there would be lots of ways to address this kind of bend toward sinfulness in order to counteract that in a very thoughtful way. It's really, really challenging though. And I think it draws reactions out of the best of us. And so the work that it takes to sort of move out of reactive mode in so many ways is tremendous. We really have to help each other with it.
I think you're right on the money, Amy. And that kind of sets up the discussion of tenderness and love and so forth that, might be the next thing for us to turn to here. So unlike this structural sin, these illusions, Pope Francis emphasizes that in our pluralistic society, we need a politics that communicates through what he calls, I think the term real dialogue. He talks about a dialogue marked by mutual respect, rational arguments, that's open to a variety of perspectives, and importantly, a dialogue that acknowledges the reality of fundamental truths and fundamental values. But then he also mentions, as part of this, the way in which this dialogue would occur, he talks about two other qualities. He talks about tenderness and love. And while I have to say, I'm enchanted by that idea, it does sound more aspirational or, I'm in real politics. There's a kind of a Pollyannish quality here, no? What do you think, Amy?
Oh, I think you're so wrong.
This
is so real, right? And I just want to quote this one of the ways in which he uses this. It's 194, where he says, "Politics too must make room for a tender love of others. What is tenderness? It is love that draws near and becomes real. A movement that starts from our heart and reaches the eyes, the ears, and the hands. Tenderness is the path of choice for the strongest, most courageous men and women." And for me, the literary key is going back to that moved from the gut, going back to creating these spaces in which we can actually listen to the stories and the narratives and the stakes and the concerns. And this capacity, he says it many times, this capacity to also weep, right? And so,
yes.
So I think this movement to say, when you move from the heart to the eyes, it's there that we develop the critical vision that we need to understand these deep aspects of the common good. The ears, it helps us to actually listen to what's going on. And then it also, I think, keeps us from a kind of frenetic activism that can be thoughtless and off the mark. So I think this, if we go back to this, move from the gut, it gives us a hand with what is the content of tenderness. It's not a sentimentality. It's a positionality that goes together with proximity. And it might be helpful to read this parallel with the Rejoice and Be Glad letter.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
To put the reflections on the Beatitudes and the content of the Beatitudes together with this kind of positionality for what is the content of tenderness. I think it's very, very rich and deep.
It's as I was listening to describe that, Amy, there's a word that's been bandied about quite a bit in the last couple of years, and that's empathy. But this tenderness that Pope Francis is talking about, you're right, that it comes from the guts. There's a depth to it, in a sense, that goes well beyond the way that we usually imagine empathy. David, I've already been shot down in thinking that this was Pollyannish, but maybe you're on my side. No.
Well, I was actually thinking that the opposite of tenderness, or the way to make sure that there is not this tenderness, is to demonize your opponent. I mean, to turn your opponent into an enemy, especially your domestic opponent, into an enemy that has to be defeated, right? And to dehumanize them or make them subhuman in some kind of way. So I agree that if we can stop doing that and just get to the level we might call respect, I'll take it. But I think genuine respect means a kind of tenderness. I mean, you know, Steve, you must know that story that used to go around, that senators used to move their families to Washington and socialize with each other,
with one another, absolutely,
and children, and these kinds of things, and that produced certain kinds of bonds between them, even across party lines, that made legislation possible. I think that is really a kind of tenderness, right? It's a kind of affection, if you want a little bit less scary word, that allows people to work together even amidst difference.
Wow. You know, I may be partially convinced, but I mean, it's a really interesting idea. I'd like to continue a conversation with you guys on this on our own, maybe away from the cameras here. But let me push on to a related topic, because along with this call for tenderness and love, Pope Francis insists. And here I'm thinking specifically about section 242 and 243 and 244. Pope Francis insists that we not fuel anger, that politics should not be motivated by revenge, that we should not allow for hatred in public life. All of that seems to fit with what you were just saying. Yet literally on the next page, at least in the way that my bound version of Fratelli Tutti is organized in section 244, he also says that conflicts should not be hidden. And he actually says this: authentic, I'm quoting, authentic reconciliation does not flee from conflict, but is achieved in conflict. Now you guys are the ones who are holding up this tenderness idea here. How do we allow conflict and recognize the value of conflict for achieving reconciliation, and yet still have, is this in tension with the tenderness that we're talking about? David?
Well, it is. It's one of Amy's, holding the opposites in tension.
Both and, yeah.
One of his 4 principles in Evangelium Gaudium is unity prevails over conflict. And by that, he doesn't mean rejecting conflict or avoiding conflict. I think the metaphor that we all recognize about marriage and family is exactly this same metaphor, that the truly united family is the family that can engage in conflict in the right kind of way, which has to be conflict that doesn't demonize the other, that isn't just about anger. I flitted to the section you talked about. He says, to be sure, it is no easy task to overcome the bitter legacy of injustices, hostility, and mistrust left by conflict. Boy, does that describe America.
Yeah,
it can only be done by overcoming evil with good. So avoiding the conflict is unacceptable, but overcoming evil with evil is not going to work either, right? Just perpetuating this cycle. Rather, there has to be this kind of general commitment to unity that gets us through the conflict.
Wow.
I think the challenge, maybe to name what is vengeance about, and maybe to contrast that with what might be the end or the hope in working through a conflict. And I mean, I have to say, in my experience in community life, I love to pick fights, and I am not a conflict averse person. And the difference between a kind of, good fight is when there's a sense that that we all have the kingdom at heart, and that the deep desire is to see the other person also grow in holiness and in hope and in grace. And I find when I experience the either pettiness or revenge or I hope I haven't experienced vengeance too much, but the sense is, how can I get you out of my way, basically? And so this sense of kind of the ways in which the ego takes over, as opposed to this effort to kind of see through how can we appreciate our different perspectives on how to build up the kingdom, for example. I mean, this would be in a religious context. And so I think there are ways to sort through. The Pope Francis gave the Focolare community these two words to meditate on, and one is I'm going to massacre the Greek again. One is hippomone, right? This kind of putting up with knowing how to bear burdens. And the other was parousia, right? Being able to speak boldly and with frankness. And he said, okay, your job as a community is to figure out how to hold these together. And then he said, take a look at Mary and meditate on the moments of conflict in her life. And we're like, oh, thank you very much, right? So this sense of also the challenge and the richness of the life of the gospel that opens out these tensions, but it's this question also of the ways in which things like vengeance and the egoism of vengeance really absolutely get in the way of that process.
Well, we've got just a little bit more time before we open up the mics to, open up the chat room to our guests to pose their questions. I have to say, though, I feel like I can't let the evening pass without some brief discussion of the problem of polarization. It's certainly something that Pope Francis, addresses at several points in the encyclical. I think we're all in agreement that there are concerning levels, whatever political party or whatever ideology you might subscribe to. I think there's a general agreement that the levels of polarization that are evident in our politics today are just really worrisome. So Pope Francis talks about this in the first chapter, for example, of Fratelli Tutti, where he traces the origin of ideologies and fanaticism to radical individualism. I'm giving you a list here: forgetfulness of history, relativism, again, in this case, more of a solipsistic relativism, and the erosions of institutions dedicated to objective truth. Okay, I actually think that's a brilliant analysis of why we have polarization. But what is Fratelli Tutti's solution? What's the remedy that we can find in Fratelli Tutti that we might apply to the problem of political polarization in our time? Amy, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, it's so challenging. And I think what we were saying before about slowing down, drawing near, creating spaces where we can really listen, and encounter. I mean, I think this culture of encounter is really the deepest balm. But maybe one kind of detail, it would be in 81 that I have actually taped to my computer. I'll just read this little passage. He says, in other words, he challenges us to put aside all differences in the face of suffering, to draw near to others with no questions asked. And I can't remember where I heard this kind of detail about the Good Samaritan story, that the Samaritan didn't go up and say, how did you get in this position? Wasn't it stupid to be going along this road? Isn't it your own fault, as my grandmother would say, right? Isn't it your own fault that you've ended up in this predicament? And so I think there's something about also the depth of that story that can help us find the generosity to not approach situations of polarization from the get-go saying, how did we end up here and isn't it your fault, right? And so that it gives us that kind of space of deep mercy just to take others as we find them, and to be found by others as we are, that can maybe help to unlock or unfreeze some of the relationships.
Good.
Yeah, I think that's very important on the personal side. And then I wanted to highlight something in paragraph 178. This is the paragraph that where Francis says, Francis entitles it "The Politics We Need." And he says that there are two key points to that politics. One is uphold high principles. So you just get sick of people like claiming principles and then sacrificing them when suddenly the principles make it inconvenient for their narrative
purpose
situation. Yes, I don't think we can overcome polarization without coming to a common sense of what are the high principles that we hold in common. And we has to be, 80%, 90% of a nation, right? And that we're committed to those principles, even though there are these other kinds of disagreements. And then the second point he makes is think of the long-term common good. And he makes a point of the long-term common good. So one of the great problems with polarization right now is everything is about winning the next news cycle, Twitter cycle, election especially. And is anybody thinking about what can America look like in 2080 or something? Are they thinking 20 years down the road? Are they thinking about a long-term common good? And I think if we did that, we might be able to overcome some of the polarization as well.
The other image, David, that comes to mind as you're speaking is also the kind of the power of the mystical body, right? And so this sense in which I don't know at what point we just bought into this dichotomous, very binary way of thinking about our social commitments, that if you land here, you're necessarily detracting from this other issue, and vice versa. And so I know this is difficult, and this in and of itself has been a source of increased polarization. But I think we have to find a way to kind of break down these binary frames through a deeper understanding of what it means to be a part of one body and working each one maybe on our, I'll switch metaphors, but on our tile of a mosaic of commitment. But we're part of the same picture. And so I think we need to work really hard to recuperate that sense of the wholeness, of the integrity of the mystical body in our social commitments.
Wow, so much to think about here. It is time, though, for us to turn to our audience. And I see already a bunch of questions popping up. And here, let me introduce Jason Miller, who's the Director of Campaigns for Franciscan Action Network, and he'll be moderating the questions from our audience. Jason?
Thanks so much, Steve. And we've already gotten a few questions in our chat, so I'll be fielding those. If anyone has any additional questions for Amy or David, please feel free to write them in the chat. If you're watching us on Facebook, write them on Facebook as well, even though it might be a near occasion of sin if you're on Facebook right now. I'm not sure, but and that's actually where I want to start. Is we're all on social media right now, right? And one of the questions was, are we ourselves not to blame for this narrative trumping truth? We're focusing so much on the system, but is it really about the people within the system?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. And I think it's important to understand that there are underlying algorithms and interests that that create the internet experience that we all have, right? And I think people are gradually becoming aware of that, but it's very difficult. And just to use an example, I was just footnoting an essay, and I needed the dates of when encyclicals were released, and I Googled them. Instantly, I got the right answer, right? But if you want the right answer about what happened at the Capitol riots on January 6th, or even what to call them, what to call that incident, the internet is going to make it infinitely harder for you to figure out what really happened, right? So and that's not a deficit necessarily in ourselves. It's a certain kind of structure. And again, it's not a matter of discarding the structure. Here we all are using the structure. It's a question of how we use it, in the same way that how we participate in markets and a society of business is a matter of how we run our business and what kinds of choices that we make. And there might be easy choices to make that aren't the right choices. And so we have a responsibility to kind of choose a more difficult path, perhaps, right? And I would say that's the uphill battle that we need to fight with the way we communicate now too, is how to make that have more integrity, even though the tendency is for it to polarize us.
That's a great point, David. And that was something I wanted to bring up myself, was that, I made a joke about this webinar being on Facebook right now, but we can also use social media for good. We can, social movements have used it, Black Lives Matter. And I mean, there's so many ways to utilize social media in a positive way as well. So that's an important point. Thank you. Here's another fun one. Is power an enemy of tenderness? Amy or David?
That would be Amy's question.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it can be. I mean, I think a thoughtful reflection on how we use power and how power is manipulated is really important. Also, just to really dig into the way that it seeps in and the way that it also can be addictive and can create a set of illusions. I mean, lots of this stuff is really tricky in terms of how it works on the psyche. But at the same time, I think our culture is experiencing a tremendous desire and need for tenderness. And there's like novels about, wounded heroes, right? And so also to take those openings where we reflect deeply on, in some ways, the power of making space for vulnerability in our interactions, our conversations, and our decision making. So yes and no, I guess. Both and would be an answer.
Jason, one of the things I might add, I think about here is that in a way, for Christians, tenderness is power. For what it's worth.
When I'm weak, I'm strong, right? I mean, that would be the core. And we haven't talked a lot about kind of the power and meaning of the cross as kind of maybe the heart of insight and the source of true wisdom. And so that might be a whole other year-long webinar, set of webinars, Steve. So if you want to work with that.
And I think we might also consider, I know in my own mind, I have seen pastors exercise power in parishes in very poor ways. And then there are other pastors who exercise tremendous power in their parish, but you see the kind of fruit that is born in the parish. And again, if we try to screen out ideology there, oh, I like this pastor because he has my ideology. No, it's really about there is a leadership style that has a kind of comfort and engagement with other people that puts them at ease, that empowers them, but that is still clearly exercising power. And I dare say Francis himself is.
Oh, that's good. That is good. Right.
Okay. Thank you for that. Excuse me, all three of you. I'm going to ask two questions next at the same time because they're both, I think, hinting at the same thing. So let me ask both of these. The first is, how do we reach the other who is blind to our love of neighbor? Engagement is necessary, but also knowing how to reach the other is essential. And then the second question, which relates, is at what point does dialogue/engagement become impossible, such as the other denies the reality of truth, they're interested only in your destruction or dehumanization, they enter into a dialogue duplicitously, etc., and the only reasonable stance left is one of resistance.
Can I go out on a limb?
Sure.
I just don't think there are that many people who are like that, really, who are really like that. I think there are people who are like that on social media, some of whom are not real people, of course. And I think there are public personalities that are like that, but I'm not entirely sure that there are large numbers of people who are completely closed to dialogue, who people are completely cut off from. And you find examples of this in ordinary America settings, right? Where there are conversations that are possible, but you wouldn't think that they were possible if you just looked at the internet representations of them, right? So I don't want to minimize the possibility that there are people who will not listen, right? They're completely in a hostile posture. But I would encourage us to try to recognize that's not most people. I feel confident in saying that.
So David, I'm going to totally disagree with you. No, no, I do think that conspiracy theories have also done tremendous damage in communities. And I realize that's not inconsistent with what you're saying. I mean, and I think the risk of the ways in which even a few people in a community kind of falling down a rabbit hole and creating a lot of confusion. So even if they're few, it can be very, very painful for concrete communities. And so we need boundaries. One of my most recent mantras is boundaries are love, right? And also setting boundaries and clarifying boundaries can be a deep act of love. Also and I guess this would be trying to put together the hippomene and the parousia, which is difficult. One of the exercises that we've encouraged in my own community is to develop a kind of buddy system. And so to not think that you have to convince the most extreme people in your life or all of the extreme people that you know, but to engage someone who's different enough who can help you understand how you sound in somebody else's ears and kind of go through the exercise of reflecting on your communication skills and strategies. And so I think if we, in some ways, just like David, if we take it down a notch and that the work is a little bit more in the center, that's where I think the real dialogue skills can be honed and developed.
Thank you for that, Amy. Next question. We've heard some folks talk about the difficulties in the US today with the demise of institutions, churches, organizations, fraternal institutions, labor unions. Do those institutions, the person asking this question suggests that they form us into responsible family members and citizens. Would that be part of our demise as we talk about community? Perhaps the book Bowling Alone, is that why we are no longer our brother and sister's keepers? I'm putting the words in the questionnaires' mouth, but David or Amy, feel free to jump in there.
Yeah, whether it's Putnam's Bowling Alone, or I think the questioner mentioned Yuval Levin's work on institutions. The idea is that we used to have relatively large institutions that brought people together who were different, and they had a certain kind of ethos. And part of what you had to learn was you had to learn how to get along with people who were different. whether it was at the bowling league or whether it was on a large newspaper staff or in a large corporation or university setting. And so you had to be formed in that way. And part of what has happened over the last few decades is more and more institutional ties have been loosened so that people don't feel deeply formed by those institutions, and that they have actually shifted their groupishness towards mixing with people who are basically like them in their exact same profession or with their exact same outlook. And so they've lost the skills that people used to have to see what they look like in other people's eyes, as Amy put it. I thought that was a great way to put it. So I think institutions are supposed to be mediating places where we can learn how to do that.
I think that the question is also kind of what is the context in which we're struggling with this. And so most of my work is with young adults, and I think that I saw almost in a visual and visceral way just an incredible sea change as I was seeing those coming of age during the clergy abuse crisis, and so this sense of just the draining of trust. And so I think part of the question is, okay, what do we do? And maybe, as Ignatius would say, how do we go in through the other person's door in terms of their concrete experience of why and how exactly trust has broken down, and also create space where they can receive the wisdom from their near peers as well. And then maybe in other settings, have contact with people who might be kind of wisdom figures for them. And so I think this is a moment where it's kind of actually an exciting moment that requires a lot of creativity, a lot of conversation with young people for what they actually want in terms of finding meaning in their life. How do we nurture those spaces? So that's it, Steve. That's another huge topic that you could talk about all next year if you wanted to.
I'm biting my tongue. I'd like to jump in now, but I'm conscious of time. So I'll leave it to, I agree with both of you. I think that you're both picking up a different side of the same issue. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like Amy's volunteering herself for future webinars. That's great. I'm glad to hear it. If I'm going to use moderator privilege though and say, David, when we talk about these institutions and how they were supposed to be so diverse, isn't church the most segregated hour of the week? If I'm at the bowling league in Toledo, isn't my bowling team going to look like this panel and not be particularly diverse?
Well, I mean, it depends on how we define diversity. So in a way, one of the difficulties with our politics is to assume that the white bowling league in Toledo wasn't diverse, which is not fair.
I can promise you, David, it's not.
Well, it might not be now, but certainly the tradition of the country is to recognize that there were people coming in the same group. The same externally identified group had very different views, right? So one of the difficulties I think we have to try to negotiate is how to figure out how the institutions that we have are closed institutions, right? So that's kind of to spin the concern about the Toledo Bowling League, to think about how all of our institutions are closed in various ways and have gates that don't allow certain people in. And again, I want to emphasize this works both ways. That's obviously true about the Toledo Bowling League, but there's really little question that the Trump phenomenon has to do with a large number of people who feel as though they have no voices in elite institutions in our society, that all the elite institutions that they see in our society are speaking with a single voice and it's not their voice, right? So, and there have to be gates there. So absolutely, I mean, to get back to Fratelli Tutti, the overall emphasis of Fratelli Tutti is there's a closed way of going through the world and an open way of going through the world. And Francis says we need the open way of going through the world, right? We need to be open in all of these areas of life that we're talking about. And we need to think about the way in which our institutions can be open.
And I think here also it's a question of stance, and so maybe again, to kind of build on these words, like this kind of, I have mercy or pity on someone who needs something from me, and instead the sense of something is going to be missing from my own humanity if I do not open, as David says. And so it's not just a question of, okay, let me grant you access to this space of power. But if I do not, I am going to be less human, less flourishing, even myself as a person. And so I think we have to kind of change the stance from, okay, here's the powerful people who say you come in, to all of our humanity is at stake. And if we don't open, we're going to just completely lose out as humanity. So it's a different configuration in terms of the interaction. Also, when we think about these questions of diversity of all kinds, I think.
Thanks for that, Amy. I know we're running out of time, but just one last question quickly, if you could both maybe answer in 30 seconds. If we disavow the need for faith, we fall into individualism that fosters disunity and division. It occurs even in churches, and it's easy to dismiss critical need for community and collaboration. Everything that rises must converge. So how do we cultivate the need for faith?
I personally, I'd be, I guess, really, really careful before I would identify someone as disavowing the need for faith. And there too, I think, it's a question of kind of coming close enough and having a real enough conversation and walking with people and eating together and spending time and then I do think it is true that everything that rises must converge, but the way in which actual people are rising is often very mysterious and hard to categorize. And so I think the kind of openness to which Pope Francis calls us to is also an exercise in discernment, that it's the spirit that's moving. And so that faith journey also might have a lot of twists and turns that are difficult to see sometimes.
Sorry, I would strongly agree with Amy. We should remember the occasion for Fratelli Tutti was Francis's meeting with the Grand Imam in Abu Dhabi, right? And this call is essentially an interfaith call. I mean, the whole document is suffused with this sense that people of faith, understood in a very, very broad sense, as Amy is encouraging us to understand it, that people of faith, people who believe in the kind of vision of the world that Francis is describing, need to come together. Now, for Francis himself, I think we cannot deny how deeply rooted Francis is in Christ. I just think that every time I encounter his speaking or read about his biography, he is rooted in Christ. Part of what gives him such enormous power and enables him to speak through all of these paradoxes is his own rooting. So I guess I would conclude in answering the question, though, to remind the Christians in our audience that rooting in Christ. But if you want an example, look at Francis as your example.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Thank you, Amy. That's a perfect spot to end on. Steve?
Yeah, I have to say, I'm blown away by the conversation tonight. It's just been a profound, it's been at moments a little funny, and I appreciate that as well. So thank you, David, and thank you, Amy, for being here tonight and sharing your wisdom. I think you've really opened up the encyclical in ways that none of us could have imagined. So it's just been really, really helpful, and we are so grateful. We are also grateful, by the way, for the sponsors who made this series possible. Thanks to all the sponsors. I want to take a moment to thank the staff of Franciscan Action Network for all of the hard work behind the scenes, not only to make tonight possible, but to make this whole series possible. It's just been a tremendously gratifying experience, and it's the staff of Franciscan Action Network that's made it all possible. So thank you. And by the way, everyone in the audience, feel free to donate to this good cause while I think about it. One final thing that I want to mention, while this is the end of the Fratelli Tutti series, we will be holding a webinar like this, focusing on response to the COVID vaccine situation. And we have Cardinal Sean O'Malley, a good Franciscan, who will be the headliner of that conversation, as well as an internist from Mass General, an expert in vaccines from MIT, and the head of mission and ethics for the Franciscan Hospital Network in Florida. They're all going to be on talking about the importance of the vaccine and the morality and ethical questions associated with it. So that will be on the 30th of June, 2 weeks from today, Wednesday, the 30th of June, from 7 to 8:15, and you'll all be invited to that if you find that interesting. With that said, thank you all. I want now to introduce our Associate Director, Sister Mary Lucy, who will bring us to a close with a prayer. Sister Lucy.
Thanks.
Looks like she's having some technical issues. Jason, would
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead and speak, Sister Lucy.
Sorry. I know that Steve has already extended thanks, and I know at FAN we're very grateful to all our presenters for all these wonderful sessions that we've had, for all who have joined them. And I also want to add thanks to Steve, our director, who has gathered such wisdom figures to share with us. I know we're very grateful for that. And I will simply close then with an abbreviated prayer from Pope Francis and Fratelli Tutti, a prayer to the Creator. Lord, Father of our human family, move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen.
Amen.
Blessings. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Lucy, and thank you all for attending this evening. There will be recordings available in a day or so, and everyone who is registered will receive links to those recordings. So thanks again, David, Amy. Thank you for everybody. Good night.